Welcome back to another episode of Research Fantasy Presents the NBA Fantasy Baller DFS edition for Wednesday, March 15th, 2017. I have to check every day because I'm usually at least 3 days plus or minus what the actual date is. Last night we offered up a core three of Paul George, who certainly underwhelmed in his performance. Carmelo Anthony, who did fine, pulling a double-double, coming close or exceeding value by just a little. And where Russell Westbrook, who was pretty obvious that he was the guy you wanted. Slates like that, it might be small, and if we're doing a core three, yeah, it's probably going to be guys that have bigger names because you're not... Being that I do a value video in addition to this one, there's nothing else really out there unless there's a situation where someone at like 6K is playing at 8K, 8.5K range. Doesn't always happen. Tonight's going to be interesting. No rant. Maybe I'll rant a little bit. The narrative game thing, I feel like every day somebody is pointing out some kind of narrative. Yesterday was Stephen Curry's birthday, or, this person is about to do this statistical feat, or this person was with this team for 12 minutes and now he's going to play him. There's very few revenge game situations that I'm going to pay any kind of attention to, and I know we have one tonight with Sweet Lou going back to the Lakers. I'm pretty sure that Lou Williams has no revenge for a Lakers team that's the worst in the league to trade him to a contender. What is the narrative? What is the revenge narrative in that? I just don't understand why we would want to try to make something up to convolute our actual statistical research process. So start getting that kind of stuff out of your mind. That's something that I know a lot of early stage DFS players try to do because they want to look for any kind of edge. But there's a lot of people who play long term that still do that. They just happen to be unsuccessful fantasy players. So there's a little bit of a nugget there. Tonight I'm going to kind of change things up just a little bit. I am going to give 3 plays. I wouldn't identify these guys as like a core 3. These are guys who I looked at their price. There was a bit of a discrepancy between specifically FanDuel and DraftKings, and I felt like it was a good idea to kind of bring these guys out to the forefront because I think for reasons for each of them, there are they become good plays, most specifically in tournaments tonight. Let's start things off with Blake Griffin, power forward of the Los Angeles Clippers, 14-6 on Fantasy Draft, 8,800 FanDuel, 7,900 on DraftKings. What do I like about Blake Griffin? What do I see? Well, number one, he's playing in the last game of the night. I always like to have some ownership of those last game of the night players because it seems like regardless of the sport, and there are some exceptions on a 5-game slate, this necessarily isn't true because there's just less options, period. But it seems like when you get a nice full slate like we're dealing with tonight, people tend to sort of ignore the West Coast games and focus more on games they're going to be up to watch. Part of the excitement of daily fantasy is watching your favorite team play and watching your players accumulate statistics while you're watching the games. Well, on the East Coast, since this game's not starting until 10:30, you might not have as much vested interest unless you're staying up and watching the game. Moreover than that, Blake has been playing pretty bad by his standards. I mean, this was a guy who was a solid contributor, a stout producer, pretty much a 45-point player a night. Every single night he took the court. Now he's in a position where on FanDuel he feels a little bit overpriced for a guy who has been consistently hitting around, that mid to late 30s mark. You need 43 fantasy points for him to hit value on FanDuel. He just hasn't done that in a while. On DraftKings, the price to me just jumps out as being far too low. You're sitting at 79, so he needs just shy of 40 to hit value, to hit 5x value, which he's done, almost every other game. since the break. That 6x value that you're really looking for tournaments, 48. In his last 10 games, he's gotten to that marker 2 times. So I think that in general, the field is probably going to look at some of the cheaper options, and I'll offer up a pretty decent one in the next video. But there's a number of guys who could be playable. There's nothing special about the matchup against Milwaukee, honestly. I mean, it's not like, it's the Lakers type situation. I think it should be a close game. Vegas kind of sees it as being maybe not a close game. I don't see it that way. Vegas also thought that the Sixers were, 17-point favorites or 17-point underdogs or something of that extent. It didn't even come close to working out that way. I always take Vegas with a grain of salt. I'm going to start tracking once we have our data feeds in place just to see the correlation between what Vegas says in real life. Let's take a brief pause here. I'm going to just run through some of the plays that aren't on our list in the non-value category that our projection model favors. Goran Dragic, Gordon Hayward, George Hill, Zach Randolph, Jeff Teague, Mike Conley, Miles Turner, Giannis, and DeMarcus Cousins. And DeMarcus is an interesting situation. We won't touch on him due to time, but he's definitely in an interesting position tonight. Let's move on to Dwyane Wade, another guy that our projection software really likes tonight. 12-3 fantasy draft, 7,300 FanDuel, 6,200 on DraftKings. This is a situation where I could see a lot of people just not wanting to play people from Chicago because there's that stigma with Memphis that they're such a good defensive team. And the only thing we could really say about Memphis is they do play at a slower pace, but the Bulls don't play at a lightning fast pace themselves. The Bulls and the Grizzlies were two teams that looked like crap for about a week and a half, have certainly kind of come around, now play each other. I think there's kind of like, I feel like this is a good position for some sneaky fantasy production because it's a game I think that will be largely ignored tonight. Again, Wade has been all over the map, but so have the Bulls. He needs 31 fantasy points on DraftKings to hit 5x value. He needs just over 37, which is what he got against Charlotte. Wade is a 40-point upside player still in the NBA. Memphis is a team that's really actually coughed up some pretty big outings to this shooting guard position. Much of it has to do with their constant rotation of their rotation. They never want to seem to play the same guys in there all the time. So I could see Wade having a 40-point night tonight, and if he's able to get there, then we are going to be happy campers. Perhaps my favorite option of the night is a guy who I could almost guarantee is going to go dramatically under-owned, but he has tournament winning potential upside, and that's Greg Monroe, center of the Milwaukee Bucks. 10-2 fantasy draft, 6K FanDuel, 5,200 DraftKings. So now we're entering a situation where Monroe is going to be playing a Clippers team that really doesn't get too small. Best case scenario is that they move Mbah Moute out of the lineup and they run with Austin Rivers and JJ Redick kind of at the 2-3, Blake sitting at the 4, and DeAndre is at the 5. That's two big guys. I mean, they're not going to be running too many down the stretch. And Milwaukee's not a team that can dictate to them unless they're winning, which I don't think they're going to be. I think it'll be close, but I do think they'll be chasing. So what is Jason Kidd going to do? You have Giannis out there who's definitely a big guy, regardless of whether he runs the point or he plays the 3 or he plays the center position. He's a big guy. Outside of that, I cannot imagine them running Henson with DeAndre Jordan. Just doesn't make sense to me. That seems like an extremely bad idea. Monroe's a guy at 5,200 on DraftKings who for 5x we're looking at just about 26 fantasy points, 27 fantasy points. 6x, you're just peaking over 30. This is a guy that easily has 40-plus point upside, so you're looking at the possibilities of grabbing almost an 8x player at low ownership, and that's how you win tournaments. You win tournaments by bringing in a guy who isn't going to be on the tip of everyone's tongue, especially since, and we'll get to him later in our value picks video, you've got Ivica Zubac at the same price. Who do you think is going to dominate ownership? We just saw Zubac get 25 and 15 and put up a 40-plus fantasy point outing. You know that Luke Walton's going to run his guys 30-plus minutes. And it's arguably in a better matchup because Houston just they can't rebound well. They can't really defend down low too well. It all kind of speaks to Zubac's game. So I think of the two guys, you're going to see 98% of the people flock to Zubac. Me, I'm going to have Zubac locked in. It's just going to mean that I'm going to be running Greg Monroe out in a lot of my utility spots on DraftKings tonight and on Fantasy Draft tonight. So I hope this kind of gives you an interesting look at how you could potentially try to play some tournaments tonight. Make sure, if you like this, to subscribe to our video. Head over to our page at researchfantasy.com. Sign up for our NBA mailing list where we send out daily advice on our for this NBA slate. Head over to Facebook, like us there, follow us on Twitter at Research and Win, and join us again tomorrow.